Welcome everyone to another installment of our Indexing Transformation Seminar Series in the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology at Stellenbosch University. Today we have a hybrid format. We have a wonderful guest, Professor Zimitri Erasmus. Zimitri is an associate professor of sociology at the University of the Witwatersrand. She completed her PhD at the University of Nijmegen in the Netherlands, after which she taught at the University of Cape Town, where she was awarded as a distinguished teacher. Her work turns around questions of creolization and theorization of race, both in the sense of, race category, the categorization of race, but also as a question of epistemology and social and critical theory. Her work, which I have been late to encounter, but partly prompted by needing to chair, is quite a fascinating kind of tour of sociological questions with questions that come out of critical theory, post-humanist theory, but also the critical Black tradition, Fanon Césaire, Edward Glissant, Sylvia Winter, and the list goes on. So in that sense, I think her work perhaps on creolization her work is testimony to some of the themes she works on, in the sense that she brings a lot of diverse thinkers together in a really theoretical engagement with this question of race, a question of the human, and the question of politics, fashion, and all kinds of other sociological aspects. So we're really excited to have you today. Thank you, Zimitri, for joining us. Couldn't come at a better time with, what a worse time to say, but a good time to think with, given the kind of unfolding events right now. So I hand over to Professor Zimitri Erasmus for up to 45 minutes. We have up to a maximum, I think, of 45 to speak, and then we have 35 minutes for discussion and conversation afterwards. Okay.
Thank you. Well, hi to everyone online and also to those of you in the room. And thank you so much for coming. And thank you, Stephen, Shahid, and Matthew for initiating this conversation about the book. The invitation gave me an opportunity to revisit the text. And this time, of course, with a fair amount of distance. And I am acutely aware of, the place that Stellenbosch University is in at the moment, with Theuns du Toit's violation of Nkuseli Kaduka. And I'm going to try to weave in, my brief thoughts on what happened into parts of my presentation. And I also just want to say that my compassion, my anger, and my solidarity, go to all of you, and particularly to Nkuseli. So what I'll do is, I begin with a brief outline of the book, in which I would like to bring to your attention aspects of its structure that might not be explicit on a first reading. And then I will talk about areas where my thought has deepened and refined since its publication. And I really look forward to learning from our conversation and hoping that you can think with me about, around some of the thoughts and questions that I have. So the central thesis of the book is as follows. Because we live inside of a racialized world, ways of seeing that underpin its material and social injustices can be apparent to us if we are willing to look. And our role as social scientists is to overturn these ways of seeing, ways of being, and ways of doing. And of course here, the question about whether Tiens du Toit should be expelled or simply suspended, right, comes into view. And what I do is I attempt to bring these ways of seeing to the surface and to begin to think through some practical and conceptual ways of undoing them. So the choreography of the book is, as I say in the preface, is arabesque. Chapters 3, 4, and 5, the look, the category, and the gene, constitute the central piece of the book. And in each of these chapters, I explore a normative way of knowing at the heart of racializing practice, with an understanding that these ways of knowing are deployed in concert. So looking regimes, classification regimes, bioscientific regimes operate in concert, not separately. So that's the core of the text. And then chapters 1 and 2, chapter 1 called This Blackness, which is about my particular experience of blackness, and chapter 2, A Conversation. Those two chapters are front props, and these give the reader a sense of the places from which I write and from which I try to live. And then chapters 6 and 7, Beginnings and Open Closure, are fluid backprops that open to further conversation. And each of chapters 3 to 6 works with a tension between taken for granted old logics for the use of race and the possibility for something new. And that tension is both, of course, part of our everyday life experience in South Africa around a whole range of racialized issues. And it is also a tension that I find very productive to think with. And I suggest that a productive negotiation of this tension implies engagement in what I call a double politics. And I coin this term from my reading of the Moroccan sociologist Abdelkabir Khatibi, who writes about a double critique. And he is among the theorists on whom I draw in the book. So what do I mean by double politics? And how do I interpret what Khatibi means by double resistance, double critique? So the first order of a double politics engages these questions. In which ways is racialization present in a particular moment? What are the material and symbolic implications of its presence? What else does this process of racialization work with in the moment under examination? And what do we learn about power from a relational understanding of these composite workings? Now, Tiens du Toit racializes his act as, quote unquote, a white thing. And he racializes Nkuseli Kaduka's person with the infantilizing address, boy. He racializes Kaduka's living space and learning materials as waste. when he urinates on them. And there is no doubt that this is an enactment of white power and a violation of Kaduka's person. And beyond that, a violation of Black life. So Du Toit's Act clearly works with the history and the legacy of the institution. It works with class and gender. And the history of Stellenbosch will always be with us. The point is, what needs to be done now? What action needs to be taken now in order to account for this history and legacy in a way that helps us build something new? So the second order of a double politics engages these questions. Given the understanding that we gain from the first set of questions, how might one move beyond critique? What might one do to shift the power dynamic in a meaningful way in the micro context? And how might one migrate such effort to shift macro structural power dynamics? What are the structural solidarities between post-1994 South Africa and revised forms of an imperialist global order? And I think here of xenophobia and of what I call elsewhere post-1994 divide and rule neoliberalism. Now we know that this systemic work is by far the hardest. And we know that the impact of the systemic work is often heaviest on the Black person. And I would like to suggest that one way of not giving up on the systemic work is to hold on to double resistance and double critique. And my interpretation of Khatibi here is that both the old and the new order need to be called into question. Each needs to be interrogated for ways in which it alienates, dehumanizes, and subjugates. Each needs to be interrogated for ways in which it conscripts us into complicity with revised forms of colonial practice. And the point of double resistance and double critique is to generate new practices in the now from which more just futures can emerge. And to think in this way about a common phrase among political directorates in Africa. There is a phrase used by such directorates. It's our time to eat, quote, unquote. And this phrase animates the value of these concepts of double resistance and double critique. It animates the value of those concepts in practice. And it clarifies for me the distinction that Fanon makes between the metropolitan bourgeoisie's racism of contempt, and I would add here, colonists and their descendants' racism of contempt, and the national bourgeoisie's racism of defense. And so in the book, I suggest that adversarial maneuvers, processes of creolization, and sociogenic ways of coming to know are among the counter-racial practices that can emerge from a double politics. And I note Toni Morrison's recently republished short story Recitative as an example of an adversarial maneuver. I have a vivid memory of working with this story in a lecture on the idea of race, and students' responses to the story revealed everyday racialized assumptions on the part of both Black and white students, bringing these assumptions to the table for us to trouble. And alongside this making of race with the inner eyes, I provide an example of such an adversarial maneuver in the realm of material life, with the case of differential billing of water and electricity in residential areas in Pretoria. And for members of the audience who wish to know more about that case, I hope you don't mind my leaving you to read it. Suffice to say that if, as Maldonado Torres puts it, sociology is not about the liberation of the people or the liberation of the citizen, or one could add, sociology is not about the liberation of the cadre, but it is about the liberation of what Fanon called the condemned of the earth. And what does this mean for processes that we today call decolonization? I think that is an important question that we need to reflect on. Now, my use of the term counter-racial is very deliberate here. It brings me to chapter 2 of the book, A Conversation, where I distinguish between versions of non-racialism. And there, I note that for colonial administrators, liberal non-racialism was premised on an instrumentalist and a politically opportunist use of colorblind discourse that pretended to forget about and to transcend race when it needed the votes of the colonized elite. And then, for the colonized elite, liberal non-racialism was premised on assimilation into dominant norms of Europeanness and participation in segregated institutions. In South Africa, this elite later combined this liberal assimilationism with a discourse of multi-racialism, which was the predominant response to colonial uses of race in early 20th century South Africa. And so what then is radical non-racialism? Historically, anti-colonial or radical non-racialism is a sustained commitment not to multiracialism, but to unity among the colonized in defiance of colonists' use of the idea of race, in defiance of colonists' use of the idea of tribe, and in defiance of conversion to Christianity for the purposes of divide and rule. And so radical non-racialism is premised on socialist principles, and it begins to find voice in South Africa in the 1930s and 40s. It is a thread of non-racialism which is very seldom spoken about in our classrooms and in our everyday politics. And its resistance to colonial uses of race is founded on the principles of non-collaboration with the British colonial state, with a refusal to participate in institutions for natives, a rejection of the modern idea of race, a refusal to organize communities on the basis of race and on the basis of tribe, and a radical transformation of the colonial order and its ways of knowing into a socialist order of local design. And these principles emerge from a radical critique of processes of racialization at the time, 1930s, 40s, and then the continuation of this particular thread of radical non-racialism through to the 1980s. And so here I think it's, versions of the same kinds of questions and principles face us today. So, for example, do we collaborate with our democratic states' provision for traditional leadership? Do we see that institution as an institution for natives? What do claims for Khoisan identity and, the latest refiguration of this House of Traditional Leaders to include, quote unquote, Khoisan as a traditional community? What do all of those questions mean? And so, and also the question of xenophobia, right? So we need to think about radical non-racialism of the 1930s and 40s and how it came up with the idea of non-racialism as a way of resisting and critiquing processes of racialization at that time. And we need to think, what are the processes of racialization that are key to our time in the 21st century? And how is the concept of tribe reinvented, if not necessarily named such, in the 21st century? And how do we resist and critique these processes of racialization and tribalization in our time? Now, it might be useful to remember here that it is Fanon who first used the concept racialization in his analysis of the tension in contexts of decolonization between struggles for recognition on the one hand, and on the other, struggles for justice and freedom. Struggles for recognition formulate claims in terms of race, custom, or tradition, and nation, as and when these articulate with legacies of the past in the present. And in South Africa today, such politics necessarily racializes claims and consequently reinscribes the race, culture, nation complex of its colonial and apartheid past. In crude terms, these struggles are reduced to questions about who was here first, who came here first, and who came here on a boat, and so should probably, quote unquote, go back home. Now, struggles for social justice are about who lives here now, irrespective of race, irrespective of citizenship. And these struggles formulate claims in terms of social issues of the present: poverty, inequality, violence, and building a future. That is one of the social issues of the present. And these issues require both the acknowledgement of racialization as constitutive of these conditions and the formation of new social relations that question both colonial and apartheid ways of knowing, as well as post-1994 re-articulations of this race, culture, nation complex. Struggles for social justice cultivate a culture of social and political consciousness, not necessarily a narrow national or cultural group consciousness. And this is where, you know, one of the responses from one of the executives at Stellenbosch to this week's violation, you know, his response was about culture, about building an inclusive culture. And I'm not quite sure that an inclusive culture is what we need to work on in order to build a more just future. And we can talk about that in our discussion. So having made this detour, what do I mean by counter-racial practice as a different genre of the simultaneity of racialized embeddedness on the one hand, and on the other, attempts to live against the racialized grain. So I move away from the idea of non-racialism to the idea of counter-racialism, precisely because we are both inside of this racialized context, embedded in it, at the same time as we are trying to live and act against its grain. And this is where I will appreciate your thinking with me, as this idea of the counter-racial is not yet fully formulated for me. And these are some of the thoughts I have about some of the thoughts of mine that live behind this notion of the counter-racial. In segregationist and apartheid South Africa, Black South Africans were clearly positioned outside of the inside of the state, outside of the inside of institutions. Maybe radical non-racialism was an appropriate politics then. In post-1994 South Africa, Black South Africans are inside the state. We are inside local governments. We are inside the universities. And this makes it differently difficult to fight against both the racisms of contempt as enacted by Theuns du Toit and the racisms of defense enacted by, for example, Operation Dudula. And thus, I argue, it requires counter-racial, not non-racial resistance and critique. So can one be counter-racial without challenging capitalism? For me, the answer is no, because these two vectors of power emerge at the same time historically. Can one do race otherwise? In this moment of a different difficulty, I'm not sure that in post-1994 South Africa one has a choice but to do race otherwise. Can one not do race at all in South Africa? I don't think so. How does one move back and forth between a politics of recognition and a politics of solidarity? And should one actually be moving back and forth between these kinds of politics? Or should we, as part of building a more just future, should we be elevating a politics of solidarity over a politics of recognition? And that's where I will close. It's probably not 45 minutes, but I think that, you know, conversation, during our conversation, I can also just participate more. Thank you.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you so much for and rich. And yeah, we have time, questions and discussions. And yeah, thank you for touching on the some of the responses today, because hopefully that will, interesting questions. Really also to link, right, between theory and between unfolding events. I see already some hands coming up in the room.
Are there any hands in this room? Okay, I'll bring it. Anyone else? Mukisa? Anyone? Okay, cool.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the talk. That was really great. I took particular note of the comment you made just before closing, where you discussed how there cannot be a counter to racism without countering capitalism as well, because we see these two bodies almost coexisting and almost, you know, in tandem with one another in a sort of cyclical sort of way. So my question kind of veers off into, I think, and this might be an assumption and this might be a dangerous assumption, but I think there might be a general lack of understanding on capitalism outside of academic spaces and what it actually exists as. So how would one in an everyday conversation, for example, discuss that point? Because that is something that I fundamentally agree with you on, but it's hard to sort of, in a sort of colloquial discussion, for example, how do you get across the message that capitalism and racism are things that you have to encounter sort of from both ends, to people who might, for example, fundamentally believe that capitalism is this net good, you know, for example. So hopefully that was quite clear. Thank you.
Shall I take more than one question at a time, Shahid, or how would you?
I think so. I see there's a few hands in the room, so maybe we can take 3 questions. Can you pass the mic around? And while I'll wait for the people online to just please put your hand up.
I don't think there are any more hands in the room.
Okay, then I think go ahead, Zimitri.
Oh, okay. Okay. You know, what I think is that those of us in the academy underestimate the capacity of the world outside of the academy to read. And part of where our you know, our underestimation comes from is because of the sorry state of our primary, secondary, and tertiary level education, right? So I can see where our underestimation comes from, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't, you know, encourage people outside of the academy to read. And the important thing for me is about history. If people understand the history of slavery as a commodification of the Black body, right, and the history of colonialism as premised on the idea of, well, initially proto-racial ideas, right? Of who is Christian and who is not, who has a soul and who doesn't, right? To the biological notion of race, right? I think that history is so important for people to understand why we are where we are today and why Black life continues to be devalued, right? And continues to be violated by, you know, consciously and unconsciously. And I mean, we can think here of our own, you know, of the ways in which the state actually violates Black people's lives as well, you know.
Yeah.
Does that address part of your question?
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. I think people are still formulating their questions in the chat. I'll take the opportunity. Oh, I see Stephen is coming.
It was so nice.
Go ahead, Stephen. You need to unmute.
So should I go ahead now?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks very much, Zimitri. And there's a lot to think about. I'm echoing a bit, I think. Is it right? Can you hear me?
I think the mic in the room might be too close to the speaker.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's much better.
Okay, great. You know, I've clearly got to think about this much more. So I'll just put out a question around, I'm very interested in that radical non-racial tradition of 30s and 40s. And in a way, you seem to be suggesting there's something still important about it. But we have to rethink it in the current moment. And I'm interested in what that means in relation to current debates and politics around decoloniality and I suppose decolonization. But I imagine decolonization still to be that mid-20th century project, whereas decoloniality is often seen to be more about epistemology and those kinds of questions. So I'm curious in how you straddle these different concepts and different politics and how you're looking back to perhaps a politics associated with New Unity movement and various other political formations and say, well, it's not entirely over. It's still got something to say, but we need to rethink and repurpose the analysis to contemporary concerns.
Yeah.
Thanks.
The F1?
I see another hand, but I don't know whether it's Stephen's quote unquote previous hand or someone else's. I'll leave you to navigate that, Shahid.
F1, are you there? I see your hand is up.
I am.
Okay.
I am here. Can you hear me? Thank you. Thank you. I think so. You know, Shahid, you're certainly for me. I don't actually have any questions immediately because I think that it was so on point, and has provided some nice reflections for us to take home with us. But perhaps actually there is a question here. I'm interested in what tends to happen in South Africa is we have incidences. I was discussing this with my sister last night. It's almost like a facial pimple that comes to it comes to the surface and pops, and that's when people are like, "Oh goodness, I have a zit on my face." But actually, the problem is systemic. It's always just underneath and actually in many cases, not just underneath. And when we talk about Black life, I think there's an important awareness for a growing body of knowledge and literature that likes to perpetuate the idea that rainbowism or non-racialism is a palatable and possibly more acceptable way to understand Black life in South Africa or life in South Africa. And so I think what you've presented here provides a very solid foundation to repurpose the conversation around this radical non-racialism, this idea of radical non-racialism. And so my question, I guess, is, what do you think is, how can we grapple with an analysis that reveals the nature of the conversation around race as something that's isolated and a little bit like essentialized rather than systemic? We should be talking about this in the everyday, but yet it tends to get smothered. After an incident happens, we talk about it for about 2 weeks, a month, and then it disappears. And then when you start talking about race as a continuation or a systemic thing, people are like, oh no, you're essentializing race. It doesn't happen. We're in a non-racial society. Yeah. It's postscript. And then an incident happens again, and then it's in the news, and then they invite the speakers onto radio, onto TV, and say, please comment on it, and then it disappears.
Yeah.
But we're not really attending to the systemic, the mushroom effect, the rhizomatic nature of race-based politics and ideas. Mm-hmm. So the question is, why is that? Can we name what that is? That it's not actually about the isolated incident. This is a remark upon something that is gross and violent and reflective of the everyday Black experience. Yeah.
Yeah. Shall I go, Shahid? Okay. Okay, so, they are renovating just outside of my office, so I'm going to just close the window, if you don't mind. Yeah, I think the workers were on lunch, and that's why it was quiet for a bit, and now the machines are going again. Okay, so to respond to Stephen, you are right when you say that I'm arguing that radical non-racial radical non-racialism tradition of the 30s and 40s remains important in the very same way that, the ideas and the practices of the Black consciousness movement remain important to us today, while at the same time, we cannot just sort of take those as a script from that moment in our history and replicate them in this moment. We really do need to rethink both those sets of ideas and practices. And I am of the view that decoloniality is not only about epistemology, right? Because as I, was saying at the beginning of my talk, ways of knowing, ways of being, and ways of seeing, and ways of doing are really all integrated. So it is only because of a particular white dominant way of knowing that Tiens du Toit can do what he does, right? And that he can inhabit a way of being that, that breathes life into that way of knowing the world. And so for me, decoloniality is also about practice. And I think this is where it really helps us to, if we are not going to talk about decoloniality in the abstract, we need to actually take everyday life examples and think with those sets of questions that I raise under the two registers of a double politics, and really work with that everyday experience for what it means for ways of seeing, but also what it means for new ways of doing. And I mean, and you can take the curriculum here, right? Decolonizing the curriculum is not just about adding new texts, right? It is also about the way in which we teach. And in anthropology here, what we emphasize is a writing intensive pedagogy. Part of what we do is we take that the idea of writing intensive and tailor it to our context by using writing as a way for students to come to voice. And so it is not simply about, mimicking for what academic writing means. We do different kinds of writing that relate to the kinds of questions that we raise in our courses. And it is also not just about how we teach, but it is about how we engage with our colleagues and how we engage with our students, right? In ways that lay small foundations for practices in the future. And so it really is about humanizing the university at the collegial level. Often we can't do this at the executive level because we just get shut down, right? But that does not prevent us from humanizing the university in the small spaces that we occupy. And then, I think that one of the reasons why we have these peaks and troughs, if you like, of focusing on incidents is because the everyday of Black life in a university is not part of the everyday of the university, right? Who thinks about the everyday microaggressions, right, that Black students and Black staff encounter every moment of the day, and then have to build into their days recovery time every single day, right? Recovery time. So when Tienis is having a good time drinking beer, some of us are actually, grinding over something small that may have happened earlier today. And we are wondering, is it just me? Am I making too much of this? Am I overreacting? Right? And we are consulting with fellow students and colleagues about what this tiny moment might mean. And I think that an awareness of the reality that these violations don't come in these moments of, in the peaks, that they are there all the time, right? I think that is what is very important for a structure like a university to bring to the fore. Now, how does one do this in practice? Oh, it's a hard one. It's a very hard one, but I do think that something like a monthly reflection on how has life been here at Stellenbosch for the last 4 weeks? You know, inside of residences, inside of departments, you know, just making the time to put these things at the center of our everyday practice would be one step, you know, of moving away from these peaks and troughs of, you know, and also of putting survivors of these violations on the spot, you know, is to make it something that we address on a regular basis. And, you know, in a serious manner, not, you know, not these kind of surface speeches and things that happen, you know, but a really serious engagement with what life has been like in the last 4 months, you know. And then I think what would emerge is, you know, a whole range of things where race, class, access to technology, whether you, how often you have load shedding, right? Or depending on where you live, all of those things will actually emerge in such conversations and will make people aware of the fact that these intersections of race and access and where you live continue to be racialized in South Africa, right? And that in addition to the old forms of racialization, there is a new form of racialization where we have students from elsewhere on the continent who are wrecked with anxiety every single day as they get on a taxi to come to campus, right? And this really is the only way that we can raise a sense of consciousness about, you know, what it means to be Black and working class, Black and middle class, and you know, Black and not a citizen of this country in this moment in South Africa. And there is a text. Do I have it here? Yeah, there is a very beautiful text. It's small, it's very small. And it's published as part of a Chimurenga issue. It's called You Look Illegal, right? And, you know, the author really raises a whole range of issues around racialization and privilege. And I am going to prescribe this little text. It's a 2022 text to my third year students for them to think about how do they see the coloniality of power present, you know, or articulated in this text, okay? How does racialization, how does the author, you know, the author's story bring this idea of racialization alive? How does it bring the idea of the coloniality of power alive in 21st century South Africa, from the point of view of someone who sees herself as privileged, Black, and who is considered not South African? And so that's, you know, I think that kind of engagement is very important at a kind of an institutional level, but of course at the smaller, you know, the smaller iterations of the institution. So the res or the corridor on the res, in the res, the classroom, the department, the postgraduate students, you know, the undergraduate students, and so on. And it has to be built into our curriculum, Efua. I think that is so important, that these issues be built into the curriculum. I'll stop there because I see there's some other people who have questions.
To me? To me?
Yes. Can I be? I think I. Can you hear me?
I can, yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for the presentation. I just want to start off by saying what Tina's did was not remarkable in any sense, or it was not surprising. I was not surprised. I'm not shocked. It was not remarkable. But what I am annoyed at the moment, and I think it's one thing I'm dealing with, is that when I talk to other people, they seem to be shocked. They seem to be shocked at the act. And for me, as a black young man coming from Pretoria, I'm absolutely not shocked.
Yeah.
I'm more concerned that many of these incidences are not coming in the public eye. I mean, had it not been recorded, for example, many people, they wouldn't have been believed. I imagine there would have been investigations, no inconclusive evidence. But now we've got it on camera. All of a sudden, we're shocked.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to understand why I'm annoyed that people are shocked.
I think it's precisely because we don't talk about these things in a whole range of different contexts, like the classroom, you know, like the staff room, for example, you know. And if you think about, you know, I think it is, was it Babawa? I don't remember the person's name who recorded you know, the violation. But there is the friend next door who says to the person recording, don't get involved because you will eventually be blamed for attacking. Rather just record it. In other words, be somewhat passive, right? Record it and then, you know, publish it. So there already, it tells you that Black students on that corridor are very aware, right, of what will happen to them should they respond in particular ways, right? In the very same way that as a head of department, right, as this romantic idea of, you know, the first Black woman to be the head of department of anthropology, I'm like, just get away with that romanticism. Let's talk about what it is like for me, right? And one of those things is that I dare not make a single error because I know that that error is going to be exploded in such a way that anyone who is Black, who follows in my footsteps, is going to be held to the error that I will have made, right? And so my life as an HOD, I think, you know, it shifts me even higher into this A-type personality. You got to do everything perfectly. Everything has got to be more than on time. You know, you have to care more. You have to show more compassion. You have to be more professional. You cannot throw your toys out of the cot, no matter how unreasonable anyone else is being. Okay, you have to contain it all, right? And the only place in which I can throw my toys out of the cot is in that private moment of what I call recovery time.
Can I ask a question? So I just wanted to go back to what you said about the infantilization of Black men into boys, and perhaps explore the fact that within residences in Stellenbosch, you see that majority of the House Committee members are white. House parents are normally white and Afrikaans. And I found this quite surprising because I came from Tux, where our residences had very strict quotas within, not only within residents that were allowed to live there, but then also within the various leadership structures. So for example, our house committees had to be half Black, half white. And so far as to go that like the one vice prim had to be Black, one had to be white. And then the overall, I suppose, demographics of the residents' heads, there was a need for Black house parents there. And so I'm thinking that this infantilization of Black men into boys that we saw during apartheid and in the colonial era, is that not reproduced by the fact that these residences within their power structures do not allow Black men that are young to make that transition into manhood and try and keep them, I suppose, at the boyhood level. Yeah.
So I think, there you have articulated something that can be addressed now, right? And also the ways in which corridors of residences are populated. Something needs to, we need to think through these things. We can't just throw people into, basically into the violence of our past and our present. We need to think about, people are living in these spaces. And what does it mean for people to live in these spaces? And I think that if House Committee members remain predominantly or only white and male at Stellenbosch, then this needs to be addressed. It needs to be addressed. The question that comes next is, what is it going to be like for Black students to occupy positions on house committees that have this history? Right? So that's the other thing you need to think about. You can't just change the faces. You have to think very carefully in consultation with the students, what that will mean for them, right? What that will mean for them psychologically, what it means for them politically, and how they will negotiate their position of power with the students inside of the res who are not on the committee. So all of those things need to be thought through very, very carefully. I mean, I think the infantilization of Black men as boys, one can see it as implicit in this way of structuring a house committee. But we also need to be very aware of, if you want to call it, the parallel existence of young Black men, right? Who probably already have gone through an initiation process of some sorts, into manhood, right? And they see themselves as men. Right? They don't see themselves as boys, whether they have now, been through an initiation process or not. And I think that conversations, right, with young Black men in residences and how they imagine life in these residences versus how they experience it that stuff must be worked with, and it can't, you can't have one session on these things, which is why I'm saying there needs to be an institutionalized way of bringing these voices to the fore regularly.
Okay, I see Stephen has his hand up again.
Yeah, thanks, Zimitri. I'm wondering what your thoughts are around, I don't know whether you've come across the work of Michael Rothberg. He wrote a book called The Implicated Subject. Mm-hmm. And in a way, he was looking at Germany and suggesting that the categories of perpetrator, bystander, and victim, which are the categories that have been conventionally used to understand, what happened during the Nazi genocide and how the working through should take place. He suggests those are inadequate in the current moment, not just in Germany, but elsewhere. And the implication of people in generalized systems of racism, classism, patriarchy and all the rest may be a better language to think through it, because people will say in the South African context, oh, I wasn't born during apartheid. I heard this today on the radio from a white person calling in to respond to what happened at Stellenbosch today. So it moves beyond that. You may not have been a card-carrying member of the National Party, but you're implicated at all these levels, at the level of the incredible racialized poverty that's part of the everyday. And that's why I keep going back to that radical tradition. I don't want to let it go too quickly, precisely because the implication of all of us, we know, but particularly white South Africans, but let's say, into a class and patriarchal system, then you've got xenophobia. There's a lot going on. And implication allows for maybe a way of thinking about it that doesn't create the opportunity to say, well, I wasn't there. I didn't do that.
Yeah.
I'm just a nice liberal.
Absolutely.
So Rothberg's book is, I think, quite interesting in that respect, in terms of the conceptual language that he makes available.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, no, I think I resonate with that very much, Stephen, because I think that each one of us, occupies all three of these positions, if you like, at different moments, which is why at the beginning, before the webinar started, I said that, this is such a difficult country to live in, because every moment of the day, you are actually questioning yourself, was I a bystander there? Am I a perpetrator? When I am at a stoplight, there is someone begging, he is not wearing a mask. And so because he's not wearing a mask, I won't roll down my window and give him 2 rands, right? This computing that you constantly have to make every single moment of the day. And then you have to make these micro decisions. Okay, if I don't give the man at the stoplight the 2 rand or the 5 rand, then the man at the Pick n Pay, parking lot, I will give him a 10 rand or a 20 rand, right? So there's these constant micro negotiations that are going on, right? And I think that bringing to consciousness through the curriculum through radio programs, through community programs, this idea that depending on the moment, we are either in two of those positions at once, right? Or in all three of them, because one can see the person recording the violation as a bystander, right? But if you think about the consequences of being a participant in that, you know, in order to resist that violation, then again, you have to, you know, you have to think about what this concept bystander means in different situations for different people. And I think that that kind of layered complexity is, you know, what needs to come through and what needs to be worked with at these, you know, monthly reflection meetings. For example, you take a real experience of everyday life and you work with it so as to allow people to understand that at one moment they might be a victim. In the same moment, they might be a victim or a survivor. I prefer the word survivor. A survivor and an actor and a bystander, all wrapped into one, you know. And the technology that we have today really facilitates this bystander, you know, more and more and more. So you often see people recording something that actually requires one's intervention, you know, and it really makes us question this relationship between the human and technology in the 21st century. And that relationship, how that relationship shapes actions toward justice. Am I making sense, responding in ways that that you find useful?
Okay, thank you.
That is very helpful. Thank you.
Zimitri, I'm just going to ask a question before I let the people, actually there are a few second hands, people are asking second questions already. I've just been waiting to, I wanted to ask you, so it's two things. It's one is about, I want to push you a bit on the way time features in your analysis.
Time.
Right, because on the one hand, you know, you speak about, you know, racialization in particular moments. And you have a theorization of different moments and what it does. On the other hand, you also are speaking about retrieving certain things from the past, right, in order to think about different kinds of politics. So in that sense, that is necessarily about transcending moments. And it's about going in particular ways. And what I'm particularly pointing to is the fact that, you know, your approach is really about race or racialization has got to do with these three aspects, right? Knowing, seeing, and being. Now, knowing and, I mean, seeing one might, you know, depending on how one understands seeing, one could easily see it as an individual kind of momentary thing. But I understand these are all being interconnected, right? So it's knowing and being are necessarily things which exceed a moment, right? Because the individual, you know, as a being comes into a world, you know, a historically formed world. Now, so my question is that, but in the sense, when you speak about the non-racialism, which you would like us to retrieve in a critical way, of course, you know, from the 1930s, you mentioned that, you know, so it's not about who came here first, who came here on a boat. You clearly, you know, referencing questions of indigeneity, but then you're suggesting it's about the social justice question, who lives here now? But the social justice question and all social justice and the critique of this kind of approach is that it is presentist. It necessarily, right, is asking us to ignore certain questions of history. The question who came here from where and how is not the interesting one. The interesting question really is about what kind of life was lived here. What kind of life lived in South Africa led up to this moment.
Yeah.
And so I totally agree with you, the critique of a kind of indigenous thing of identity. But I'm also seeing the social justice, what do we do now, as introducing another idea of time which completely obfuscates in all kinds of ways, you know, the process of the life, of the living.
Yeah.
Right? My second related question is then to, you know, about this question, related again to this idea of the, you know, the 1930s non-racialism and what happens to it. But it seems to me that you then slip, you know. Oh, so related to this first part about the time is because I'm somewhat familiar, and many of us are familiar and very convinced by much more sophisticated work, which understands that race and racialization is not about the moment. It is about enlightenment. It is about, if the moment means 500 years, then okay. It is about literally deeply entrenched in philosophical thought, right? The idea of the other. We don't have time to go into this. But so that really upsets all these kind of, you know, time questions, like, oh, there was science in 19th century, then there was apartheid, post-apartheid. No, these things don't work. So the social justice idea, which eradicates the whole question of time, is particularly part of that. That's part of the problem. But anyway, this is the second part. The second part is that you then move into this whole thing of xenophobia. And then you start treating xenophobia as a kind of racialization. Xenophobia is only racialization if we take it on a very simplistic level, that, oh, the people are actually black, but it's a question of power. But to say that people are actually black is to fall into that same racialized, you know, and this is a massive critique of certain non-racial thinking. They employ phenotypical categorizations of people at the same time that they disavow race as something to think with. It is racist. It is racist to say that, oh, look, white people were part of the struggle. Or, oh, look, black people hate other black people, you know? So I'm just questioning this whole thing. You know, what do you mean like the state is inhabited, it's now a black state, right? We need a theory of the state to understand, right? That what it means to have a black state, I would think. Not just that there are supposedly people with darker color skin who now work in the institutions. Like, I'm just worried that this falls into, and the reason I'm mentioning xenophobia is because it seems to me when you spoke about, say, the privileged person who's black and not from South Africa, then we start speaking about race as a question of skin color, but also a question of identity, nation, where you come from. So in a way, there seem to be different conceptions of race operating in your work, and yeah, which one is it? Are we thinking about race here in terms of identity and color? Or are we thinking of this as something about othering and, you know, much more significant processes? You know, and just to end, because I think, I mean, at the end of the day, right, we can only have a solution, because in the sense that you've said, like, we need to do something, right? We can only have a convincing solution if the diagnosis is also convincing. And here, of course, I'm invoking for not, right? Because a misdiagnosis easily results in a whole lot. So really, that's my question. Is xenophobia, because xenophobia doesn't involve, yes, it's about other people, but xenophobia in this sense is part of the nation state. Modernity does as nation state does. So why is this really the issue we have to worry about? Of course, nationalism, liberalism, xenophobia, everything. Is it really comparable to race as the production, as like a deep production of the human? You know, in institutions, in science, in knowledge, in the body. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I think that probably what is not coming through is that in the question of social justice now, my intention is not to obfuscate history, right? That's the one thing. And the other thing is that I really work with Stuart Hall's conception of articulation. And that is where one conceives of this moment, right, as borrowing from the past, borrowing all sorts of ways of knowing, ways of seeing, and ways of being, and ways of resisting, borrowing bits and pieces from the past and reconfiguring them for this moment. And that for me is how time works, that it is layered, right? And that the idea of the nation has always been racialized and remains so. And it is racialization of nationalities that I am speaking of, rather than phenotypic, you know, rather than what people look like, because it is read off the body, right? And that reading of the body is the racialization of the non-national, right? Because you can't just look at someone and know that they're illegal. You either hear them speak, or you think you know that they look illegal, or they have particular scarifications that are not familiar to you, or they can't, you find out that they can't speak, you know, a local language. And that is the catalyst for the processes of racialization. And so yes, ways of knowing, seeing, being, and doing exceed a moment. That is correct. And they draw on ways of knowing, seeing, and being from the past. And what I'm arguing is they can also rework those ways of seeing, knowing, and being in the present, right? And this is where the counter-racial is important for me, is that we are all working with both in the same moment. We are working with the reality of the past in our present, at the same time as we are working with reshaping that past for a better future. And that, I think, is the complexity of what I'm trying to bring across. And that is also the arabesque structure of the book, right? And it really here works with Sylvia Winter's understanding of history, right? Which is that elements of the past are carried over into the present, but are reconfigured for this moment, right? That doesn't mean that we've left the past behind, right? But we have sort of almost recreated it for this moment. But what I'm trying to say is that there is also the possibility of making something new in this very moment when the past is being reconfigured.
I see one more question. Maybe we can have that as a quick last. Okay, two more. Okay, you guys can have each 1 minute each because we started a bit late.
Thank you. I'm sorry, mine's just a bit of a practical question. Oh, sorry. Are you asking me or the people online?
Okay, you started.
Okay, sorry. Mine's a bit of a practical question, and it brings us back to the Stellenbosch space. So in transformation, which we know Stellenbosch as a predominantly white university is quite behind on, there's a transformative responsibility placed onto Black students and staff to make their voices and sufferings known to those who are perpetuating the micro and violent aggressions, right, i.e. the white community in Stellenbosch. And so you spoke earlier about bringing Black voices and experiences to the fore in a regular manner. And there's also this idea of, you know, white students listening to Black voices in informing their behavior as in non-racist and anti-racist behavior as a means of transformation. But how do we practically institute transformation measures without placing this burden on Black students and staff?
Exactly.
Great.
And
One
this
more-
is
one more question from F1. Sorry. That's a-
Yeah, hi. Yes, I think let me try and be brief. And it echoes what Dr. Malope had said, was that he is unsurprised at these actions. And in a way, a lot of me agrees with that statement, because this enactment, this embodiment of this practice of urinating on someone, it's happened before in South Africa, in Cape Town's history. The other time was in Claremont, where a young, once again, a young white man peed on a taxi driver's head. So it's not. I think that there is something to remark upon. So unlike Dr. Malope, I think it is something that we can remark upon, but also to understand it with a very sober mind, that it is not something that is. It's unsurprising, but it is remarkable. And when we set units like the equity units to attend to these kinds of things, that's also a problem. So your practical suggestion of having, you know, monthly discussions, I think is useful, but it's also something that the university will never take on board, because they feel that having an equity unit and a transformation unit is done and dusted. The work is done, because they are unaware of the everyday of Black life. And then also just to comment on Shahid, you know, I think that there is something to be said about the nation state and xenophobia. However, there is an added layer in South Africa of being a Black person who's also labeled as a foreigner, because there's a more nuanced discussion and a different narrative that takes shape based on race, because of South Africans, predominantly white, actually most South Africans, but in this instance, white South Africans will treat you, I've heard in my experience of South Africa, oh, you're not like the rest of the Blacks here. And that's not a question of necessarily privilege and power, but it is, if you're from Zimbabwe, or you're not lazy, or so they're constantly operationalizing racist ideologues and creating a hierarchy of Blackness within that, which I think is a racial question. So this is also part of the way in which xenophobia bleeds itself into these conversations around race. And I'll leave it there.
Okay, I hand the floor to you for the final comment.
okay.
There's just one more question in the class, if there's time.
I think we have to.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm straining to hear at the moment. Is there another question, or shall I proceed?
There was one, but I suggested that maybe it's late. Okay, Jurkens, we can have the question of the class. We can end in 5 minutes time. Okay.
Okay, I'll make it quick. One thing that I just wanted to bring up, and maybe it's because I've been reading a lot about ethics and feminist ethics, especially. Something that has been brought up. You talked about how institutions can kind of do these repeated ways of talking, and one thing that I have a question with that is, a lot of times the things Stellenbosch does on an institutional basis feels very hollow, and it feels very procedural.
Yeah.
And the moments of yielding, or the moments of connection that have been the most meaningful to me, not just according to race, but to homophobia and sex and gender and all those questions of social justice, have been very intimate, very personal. And it's like these moments of intimacy that the most healing has happened.
Yeah.
And what I want to ask is, can you either replicate the feeling of intimacy in institutional structures,
Mhm.
or can you somehow cultivate moments of intimacy, moments of healing on a personal basis? And if so, how do you cultivate it?
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Elena, let me take the last one because I see the hand going up and down. So, seeing that we've gone over, Leela, did you have another question? Do you want, it can be very short.
Thank you. I think it's my first one. I wanted to say I think it's very useful, these tools to think through race, because as you showed with your everyday examples about the robot and shopping and parking lots, it's constant, difficult work to do race in South Africa. And I find myself asking, what is the purpose of this work? Just thinking, what is the science and what is the action part of it? And I find it very useful. And I also found myself leaning towards a question. I think maybe the volume on that speaker is very loud because of the echo. I'm sorry. But I also found myself leaning towards the question of time. And there's another recent small little book, Panache Shikumache's These Bones Will Rise Again. And she's got a very interesting concept of time, which I think really resonates for me with what I got of your talk today, which is what is the answer? It's not one grand answer. Does race matter or not? Should we see race or not? The answer is much more difficult than one grand answer that can be sustained over time. One theoretical answer that manages to trump all others. It's constant, difficult work. And she captured that in her book when she referred to the kind of linear concept of progress of time as a colonial concept of time, and that we need to think about these waves of oppression coming more to the fore and retrieving more. And it also resonated to some degree with your mention of recovery time. You mentioned it in a different concept, but perhaps we can catch our courage at the times when that wave has retracted, and then the issues step to the fore at the times when the waves are crashing around us.
Yeah.
But thank you for the tools and for emphasizing context matters. The answer won't be final.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, guys. Thanks for all your questions. I'll hand over to Zimitri now.
Okay. So the first question about the practical question, right? About, yeah, if you have these quote unquote dialogues, then basically, you know, what they often turn into is Black people kind of, you know, putting their souls on show. Now, that is not the kind of work I'm talking about. The kind of work I'm talking about is that white people at Stellenbosch need to understand who is doing the race work every single day at that institution. Who is doing this work, right? And the burden of doing the race work, how heavy that is, right? That is what needs to be understood, and that people need to ask themselves, well, what is the race work that I need to do, right? As a person considered white in this institution. That is where this, you know, these institutionalized or well, institutionalized might be the wrong term. I was actually thinking to just respond to, you know, the member from the audience who was talking about the procedural and hollowness of these dialogues, right? What I'm thinking about is precisely the intimacy of the corridor in a particular residence, right? Because what happens on the corridor? You use the same bathroom, right? You're walking in the same passages, okay? You are living in the same space. And to really have a conversation about what that means, I think is what is important. So I don't mean institutionalizing these dialogues at that procedural hollow level, but I am talking about making this work part of the living inside of the residence, part of the engagement inside of the classroom, you know? And the way in which I, for example, make my experience as an HOD, I've made it part of the conversation of a staff meeting. You know, I was very clear that, you know, yes, this romanticization about first black woman, blah, 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 is one thing. But let's talk about what you can do, right? Given the heavy burden that I carry. What can you do as staff, right? So it is those kinds of things that are actually about the intimate at the level of the workplace, right? In order to humanize the institution. Now, I know that my colleagues, you know, some of my colleagues would not have thought about the way in which I think of my place as an HOD, right? So it was very important for me to articulate that, but not so much to put myself on show, but to raise the question to colleagues of what can you do, okay, to ease this burden. What can you do? So I think I've sort of answered the first and the third question in some ways. So it does come down to the personal, but how do we make that personal political, but not towards the bottom of the power hierarchy, towards the top? Let's play the personal is political to the top of the power hierarchy, because this is really what we need to address. We need to address the tiens du toys, and the tiens du toys need to start speaking too, right? And just the last question, I think this point about at the stoplight or in the classroom, for me, it is always about race and class and gender, you know, and space, all at the same moment, right? Because this is me as a woman alone in a car, right? Negotiating this space of the beggar, right? The homeless person who is a man without a mask. So we need to add COVID-19 to this context at the moment, right? And then just the last thing. Yes, we're not shocked, said the second speaker, while at the same time it is remarkable that the stuff happens all the time. And that is what needs to be brought to the surface, is the enactment of white power on an everyday basis. That needs to be made real.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Erasmus, for this fascinating. It's been very engaging. We've been 15 minutes over. There's so many, yeah, fascinating discussion and a set of questions. Thank you so much, and hopefully, well, yeah, for those who are interested, you'll be able to catch this online, uploaded soon, and hopefully we can welcome you again to, and hopefully in person at some point. Yeah.
Hopefully, yes.
Right.
Thank you so much for the invitation and also for the questions. And yeah, sure. I don't know what to wish you at Stellenbosch University. Strength, maybe, perseverance, because resignation is definitely not, we can't resign ourselves to this reality. I don't think that's an option. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Zimitri. And thanks, Jay.